Hi, it's nice to see you today, Robbie. Thank you for inviting me to ask you questions.
Oh, well, thanks for coming. Yeah.
You are known as the founder of PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, but your new book reflects not only your professional side, but your personal side. You grew up in the South, and you had experiences with racial division and racial tension. So can you talk a little bit about a few of the remembrances of that time and when and where you were?
Yeah. No, you're right. This book's a little bit different than a book I've written in the past, and I'm at the same time wearing kind of the social science hat, and that's part of what drove me to write the book, is seeing patterns in the data. For example, that white Christians were very consistently further away from African American attitudes on all kinds of racial justice issues than whites who were unaffiliated. And so seeing that pattern over and over, not just in one question, over and over. And then my own experience of growing, I grew up Southern Baptist in Jackson, Mississippi for the most part. And then my family goes back 6 generations on both sides to Middle Georgia, Bibb County, Twiggs County, Macon, Georgia is where both my parents grew up. So we have this deep affiliation, and Baptist all the way back. I'm very grateful for the Baptist Joint Committee having me today. And in some ways, I know we have a much broader audience, but we have a core audience of people who are, they're my people, right, where I grew up. And one of the things that after seeing this, this book has really been a personal journey. And I thought back, and one of the things I did after seeing all this data, thought, I need to really dig into this, what's going on, right? That in 2019, we're seeing this kind of disparity, and that Christianity seems to be playing not a mitigating role on issues of racial justice, but actually one that puts more distance between white people and their African American brothers and sisters. What's happening there? So one of the things I did is I kind of went back and looked at my own growing up and just spent a little bit of time trying to let stories come back. Where did race erupt into my consciousness? And just a couple stories. One is, so I grew up in elementary school in the 1970s, and I remember the first African American kids coming to our school. Now, Brown v. Board of Education's the mid-1950s, so it took nearly 20 years, right, for that to really become a reality in the Mississippi that I grew up in. Those kinds of memories I saw, again, as late as the late 1970s, the KKK handing out literature and taking donations, standing on the corner at Battlefield Park in Jackson, Mississippi, where we played soccer. So as we took a left turn into the soccer fields, we had to pass this demonstration. Again, this is late 1970s. It's not there. Our soccer team had a party, and we were going to have a swimming party at the Moose Lodge, and we had to cancel at the last minute because we found out that they wouldn't allow us to come because we had African American kids on our team. And through all of that, I was at church 5 times a week growing up. I was that kid, right? Went twice on Sunday. We had Monday visitation. We had Tuesday Bible study. We had a Wednesday prayer meeting. I was there all the time. And one of the striking things I think in sitting with this is I heard virtually nothing about racial justice, about what we might owe to African Americans, about the role that white Christians had played in slavery, segregation, tearing down Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. None of that. There was just a deafening silence.
And this is a silence that Martin Luther King, criticized Southern churches for having. And
Yeah.
It seems like you're saying that silence is still
Yeah, well,
with us.
case in point, right? So I went to Mississippi College, a Baptist college. I have a degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. But it wasn't until I was at Emory University in my 20s that I read Letter from Birmingham Jail, right? And when I did, it was exactly this. King talks about people sitting, anesthetized behind their stained glass windows, right? And that was exactly my experience growing up. And so that was that experience, and seeing the continued patterns in the public opinion data today. It was really those two things that pushed me, I think, to try to, one way to boil it down is just really try to tell the truth about where the church has been and the legacy of where the church has been that is still very much with us today.
Before we get into some of the statistics and your research, I want to ask you about the phrase white supremacy.
Yeah.
You say that can actually soothe rather than prick the consciences of white Christians. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge, and that one of the things I've experienced personally when trying to talk to people about this is if you bring up white supremacy, what many, if you think about like a white middle-class person who's going to a Baptist church and giving their tithes and offerings, and is that's not me, right? That's the first hands go up, not me, and that's because I think that has that is really associated very easily with, oh, that's just that is those people on the corner in their hoods. That's what white supremacy is. But I think we've got to get well beyond that. And it doesn't take that much work, but that is the knee-jerk defensive reaction, I think, among most whites. But if we just flip the words around, the supremacy of whites, and you really think about American history, it's not that hard to see how society has been set up that way, right? Everything from restrictive neighborhood real estate requirements to mass incarceration, differential sentencing requirements, or even something as recent as today, looking at COVID-19, right? If you look at the rates, African Americans far more likely because they're in at-risk jobs that have to be face-to-face. Also health disparities, and there's a poll out today that just shows, for example, African Americans are 3 times as likely as whites to know someone who has died of COVID-19. Now, those aren't accidents. Those are the results of really centuries of structural injustice built into our institutions and our psyches.
So one of the questions you hope to answer in your book was how prevalent are racist and white supremacist attitudes among white Christians today? And you used what you call a racism index. So what did you determine?
Yeah. Well, one of the tricky things about public opinion data and sensitive questions like racism is that you can't just straightforwardly ask people, right? You can't say, well, do you consider yourself a racist or not, right? You know what kinds of answers you're going to get from those kinds of questions. So one of the things we try to do with public opinion research is not rely on one question, not rely on even a question self-identification that's right on point. But what we did is we built this, what I call a racism index in the book. That's built actually of 15 separate questions, all right, that covers things like institutional racism, things like policies, things like Confederate monuments, like a whole range of things. And then using some statistical methods, we build them into one composite index. So that way one question isn't playing too much of an outlier role there. And when we put that together, what we essentially found is that there's a strong relationship between white Christian identity. And I should be clear here too, that, so I grew up evangelical, Baptist, but what I think, one of the things that I saw in the book and that I had seen in patterns but confirmed in the research is that this is not an evangelical, not just a white evangelical problem. This is a white Catholic problem, and this is a white mainline Protestant problem, right? And that we saw among all 3 of these groups, even when you control for a whole range of other characteristics like partisanship or region of the country, that we still see a positive independent relationship between holding more racist attitudes and white Christian identity when compared to whites who are unaffiliated. And that, again, that goes for both white Catholics and white mainliners and white evangelicals.
And was there something you found out about regions too, that even though people have this image of this being a Southern issue more than anywhere else, that maybe that's not always the case?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. I mean, what we found is that there has been, because of the way that Christian churches have sorted themselves over time, there's a regionalism here. So white evangelicals more dominant in the Southeast, white mainline Protestants and white Catholics kind of share the space in the Northeast, white mainliners more in the upper Midwest, and actually on the West Coast, it's really more the unaffiliated there. But when you look down at the regional levels, what you see, for example, is that white Catholics and white mainline churches in the Northeast really became, in some ways, the institutional holders of racist attitudes among whites in the Northeast. In fact, the biggest gap between white unaffiliated folks and white Catholics or white mainliners is in the Northeast. That's where those differences are actually the biggest. So it's a little bit of a surprise on the face of it. Now, if you look at the history, the institutional history, which I do unpack in the book, it becomes less of a surprise. It's just a kind of this image that we have that this is only a Southern problem or only an evangelical problem. But the problem is much deeper and much wider.
And some of the research you highlighted deals with events that we're dealing with right now in recent weeks. And so in the wake of the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, there have been governmental decisions about removing Confederate symbols and in some cases protesters taking them down. What did you find out about that in your recent research about how white evangelical Protestants, mainline Protestants, Catholics say about those kinds of monuments?
Yeah, so again, the pattern is just very clear. So for example, on the killing of African-American men by police, we have a question right on that. It's part of this racism index we talked about in the book. But it's really notable that white Christians, and not just evangelicals, but also white mainline and white Catholics, are essentially twice as likely as white unaffiliated Americans to say that the killing of African-American men are isolated incidents and not part of a broader pattern. So this inability to see structural racism is what we're really talking about. That, the couple of bad apples is just an isolated incident. It's not and we've heard, people from Trump to Barr to members of the president's cabinet basically saying we don't have a systematic racism problem in this country. But clearly the data shows that that a lot of white Christians share that worldview and that mindset. But it's white unaffiliated Americans. The same thing holds true on the Confederate flag. We had a lot of the Mississippi Baptist Convention. We have a lot of big Baptist audience today. Came out, just last week saying, or earlier this week saying that they were calling for the state to remove the Confederate battle flag from the state flag. That's a big deal. But in the rank and file, the last time we asked this question last fall, we found that that's really not white Christians are. White Christians of all stripes are 30 percentage points or more likely to say that the Confederate flag is a symbol of Southern pride rather than racism compared to white unaffiliated Americans. So just kind of put all that together, if you ask the question on these kinds of questions, the killing of unarmed African American men by police, the display of the Confederate flag, who is closer to African Americans on this question? It is not white Christians, it is whites who are not Christian and religiously unaffiliated.
Yes, indeed. So I have to note that your book has a lot of history in it, and it includes history related to the Confederacy. And I wonder if there's an example or two you could talk about how embedded those images are in churches across the country.
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say, the first sentence of the book has the word I in it. So I am putting myself in the story, but the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the denomination I grew up in, was explicitly founded, right, to allow missionaries to hold slaves. Like, this was the dispute between the Northern and Southern Baptists, and in 1845 they formed their own convention. And the founders of that were some of the founders of the convention. Basil Manley Sr. Was not only the person who kind of was an architect of pulling the convention away from the Northern Baptists, he was also the first president of Southern Seminary. He was the president of the board for 10 years at Southern Seminary.
The flagship seminary,
the flagship seminary of the convention. And that history, it is the founding story of our denomination. And yet, growing up, again, it really wasn't until I was in seminary. So I grew up going to church all this time, went to a Baptist college, and it was really not until I got into seminary that I ever confronted, this truth about the country. And I think where this goes for me is, like, what does it say about a faith that was founded by design to be compatible with slavery and white supremacy? What does that mean in 2019, 2020? For us today. And I think we're at a moment of reckoning in the country today where that question is getting called. And I'm hoping one of the things the book will do is kind of help white Christians sit with that question long enough so that they don't just go, oh, not me, not us, but really sit with this question long enough for it to sink in. And when we see these patterns in the data, once you really take in the history, the question is really not, how can this be? The real question is, how could this be otherwise, given the history?
So as people maybe start to sit with those questions and hear these statistics and see the violence replayed over and over again on their screens, they often wonder, some do, what they can do. And you talked about the story of two Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. And it had very dramatic twists and turns related to race and religion. So I wondered if you could share a little bit about that. Yeah,
I'm happy to. So, one of the things I did was try to look to see what are people doing on the ground. This is obviously very... we're talking hundreds of years of legacy, very tough work to undo, to even think about what to do. And I tried to keep the story close to home. So, both my parents grew up in Macon, Georgia. So briefly, there are two First Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. This is not like a marketing escalation gone awry. They actually used to be the same church. And this was pre-Civil War, right? And they split right before the Civil War. And it used to be one church with African Americans sitting in the back and white sitting in the front. Then it split. They were their own church, but under white leadership until after the Civil War. But once that got established, there was 150 years where there's very little interaction between these two churches with this shared history. And even as they moved around, they basically have settled literally around the corner from each other in a not huge town, right, in Macon. But about 10 years ago, two pastors got together, James Goolsby at the predominantly African American church and Scott Dickinson at the predominantly white church, and finally just said, look, what can we do, right? And began this process of community, of building community, and building accountability, and in the white church in particularly, owning this history, right? And really telling a truer story about their churches and what it meant. There's a lot more in the book, but I want to be careful to say it's certainly, and I'm sure that Reverend Goolsby and Reverend Dickinson would want me to say this, certainly not a perfect story or a fairy tale, but it is an example of the very hard work these churches have done together that have changed, I think, the conversation and changed the experience, particularly, I think, in the white churches, for really trying to come to terms with this very, very difficult history.
One part of that story is that they ended up taking basically a pilgrimage to what is known as the Lynching Memorial, or the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And so there may be some people who aren't ready to take a pilgrimage and get on a bus with people who don't look like them, but are there other first steps that, given your personal experience that you have explained in the book, that you think people might take if they want to try to do things differently?
Yeah, I think some really basic stuff. I mean, for me, and I'll just be very personal here, it was really a week of journaling, right? Just sitting and letting the memories come. Because I think for most white Christians, those memories are there, but they've been pushed way, way down and sit somewhere below the level of consciousness. So just sitting long enough every day to start letting those memories come, and then talking to people who were there and sharing those memories. And I think starting to tell these stories is a way of starting to tell the truth and letting them get moral purchase, I think, on us today, right? Because if you can't tell these stories, I think things can't be changed. I mean, I read a lot of James Baldwin, working on this book, and one of the things he was like really clear about and is quoted a lot about, that you can only change things that you can see and that you can talk about.
There was a provocative statement that you made in one of many in your book, where you talked about how even basic Christian practices like focusing on a quote-unquote personal relationship with Jesus can be used to reinforce white dominance. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so the real question, I think, is there has to be a kind of interrogation of the faith, I think, by white Christians. Because, again, if you go back to, it's not just the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention. Every denomination split over the issue of slavery in the Protestant world. And the Catholic Church has its own kind of shaky history with racial justice in the country and discrimination. So I think thinking that through, I think, is, part of the hard work that we've got before us today.
Okay. So you mentioned Southern Baptists, and they are highlighted quite a bit in your book, but I also wonder whether there's another denomination that you might point out, maybe on the mainline side, that is something that people can think about so they don't just sort of pigeonhole this into one area of Christianity.
Sure. Well, I mean, the largest mainline Protestant denomination is the United Methodist, was known today as the United Methodist Church. And, there it's like notable because they split into a southern division and northern division of the Civil War, came back together, but notably when they came back together, even when they went in and were admitting African American churches into the denomination, they segregated them into their own jurisdiction called the central jurisdiction. And that was a really weird thing to do for Methodists because it's usually a geographical sorting, right. But they took all the African American churches and stuck them there. And the reason was that would water down their power in the denomination, right? That's why that was done. It's essentially religious gerrymandering is what was happening. So that was there. The Episcopal Church, historically, was one that at the same time Martin Luther King wrote Letter from Birmingham Jail, published in the Christian Century, which is a mainline denominational magazine. He was actually an editor at large at the Christian Century, so they're very invested there in King's work. At the same time, a private school in Atlanta that was affiliated with the Episcopal Church turned down King's son for admission on the basis of race, right? So there's all this kind of working, and there is, I should say, important shifts happening here. So I mean, there's a very tough history. There's very important shifts happening in the country today.
Is there something you're seeing a denomination doing now that is a sign of progress after all the history you just mentioned? Yeah, well,
after Dylann Roof, murdered parishioners in Charleston, one thing that I think went under the radar that I think is both a challenge and a sign of hope here is that he was a baptized ELCA Lutheran, right? In his prison journals, he had a journal he had in prison. He was sketching crosses and pictures of white Jesus in his journal, right? And that was integrated into his into his strategy of starting a race war in the country. I mean, it was his Christian identity was part of that, not separate from it. But the ELCA, as denomination, came out afterward and owned that, right? And really said, like, yes, he is one of ours, and we are going to wrestle with what this means, and actually, had education materials produced, and really started expanding their work, I think, in the racial justice space. So I think there has been a responsiveness. I think Charleston changed things. I think Charlottesville changed things. And I think George Floyd is changing things. And so there was this momentum building up, that has been building up over the last 5 years especially. And I think what we're seeing today is an unleashing of this pent-up energy, right, that we have seen. And I think, again, calling the question, and it's going to be put to white Christians. Look, you played a part in building this world that's coming down around us in many ways. What part are you going to play in, yes, tearing down things that need to get torn down, but also rebuilding something new in the country?
So my final question is about, again, going back to Mississippi. You grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and you returned there recently as you were completing your book to the first and only civil rights museum publicly funded by a state. So as you look back on your childhood church experience and how a museum like that portrays predominantly white and black Christian churches, what strikes you about how far we've come and how far there is to go on the issues we've discussed today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I was surprised. I went to that museum fairly skeptical, having grown up in Mississippi and it being a state-funded institution. But I have to say, it's a remarkable place. It tells the story without flinching, and it does tell the truth. So it not only has what you might expect, a tribute to African-American churches and the role they played in organizing the civil rights movement. It has that, but it also has like a pretty honest display of the role that white Christian churches played in the massive resistance to civil rights in the country. And I tell that story a little bit more in the book. But what I think happened is that white Christian churches went from that massive resistance, literally posting deacons as bouncers on the outside of churches to prevent African Americans from coming into worship services up into the 1970s. This is not that long ago. But I think the shift has been mostly from that to silence. And I think that's the new moment, is that I think silence is no longer going to be acceptable, right? And I think particularly just in a practical way, white Christian churches are losing members, and white evangelicals, for example, have gone from a decade ago being 21% of the country to 15% of the country today. Most of the people they've lost, young people, and young people are not, I think, going to tolerate silence on the issues of racial justice today. So I think just from a pragmatic point of view, much less being the right thing to do from where we are in our history, and particularly the role that white Christian churches have played, I think the question is being called, and the question is whether white Christian churches are up to answering it.
Thank you very much for your thoughts,
Thank
Robbie.
you. Yeah.
And I'll leave you to share some of your other final thoughts.
Great, thank you. So just a couple of closing thoughts, and thank you all for being with us here. I do want to just kind of pivot back. I do think that we're at a moment of reckoning for the country today on the issue of racial justice. There are signs all around us that the monuments to white supremacy are coming down, whether it is Walmart, NASCAR, and the Mississippi Baptist Convention calling for the removal of the Confederate flag from the state flag, or whether it's the statue of Jefferson Davis coming down in Richmond. Very major monument that was founded, and really that monument was baptized and sacralized by white Christian churches when it was put up in 1907. And churches actually moved their buildings to be in the shadow of that monument that has just come down in the last couple of weeks. But I guess where I'd end is that the external monuments to white supremacy in the country are not the only things that were built during that time. We have inherited, and now I'm speaking as a white Christian, have inherited a Christianity that was by design built to be compatible with slavery, segregation, and white supremacy. We've inherited that. It's in the DNA. And the question, I think, for us, and I guess what's clear, is that we really do have to find the will and the conviction to have the hard conversations, to tell the stories, to really rescue the faith, I think, from the distortions that history has brought forward to us. It's certainly the right thing, a necessary thing to do, And I think if we don't find our way to do it, it won't be because it's not possible or not necessary, but because we have, I guess, decided that we've just been white too long, to take the title of the book. So I think the opportunity here, though, is to begin a kind of truth-telling campaign, and that truth, I think, can, in biblical words, set us free, and it can really put us on a journey and a path of reconciliation, a path of justice and repair that only truth-telling like that, that's a path that only truth-telling can open up.